Welcome to the Real Thomas Jefferson, episode 18. Wow. Thomas Jefferson on the trial interview with lawyer William Hyland is what we'll be discussing today. When Dr. Holowchak first began to look into the Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings fiasco, one of the first books he read was William Hyland's In Defense of Thomas Jefferson, the Sally Hemings sex scandal, published in 2009. He told me that he found the argument neatly elaborated and persuasive. Mr. Hyland, in Gist, argues in the book that there were the case of Jefferson's paternity brought into the court of law, Jefferson would be exonerated. What are Hyland's arguments, and how does he arrive at his conclusion of exculpation? Those two questions we ask him and answer today. I am Donna Vitek, and this is the Real Thomas Jefferson, episode 18.
Donna, you didn't say anything with the word real in it in the introduction, so maybe I'll interject and say, did Jefferson really have an affair with Sally Hemings? We're trying to answer that. All right, let's get rocking.
Oh, now you have to edit that out.
No edits okay. Here, we just go.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for joining us today, Mr. Hyland. It's a pleasure to have you.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
Yes, it's not only Mark's voice I have to listen to today, so that makes it a bonus. Okay. Yeah. Question number one. We always see who can get the best digs at each other. Question number one. Mr. Hyland, tell us something about yourself. How long have you been practicing law? How did you become interested in Thomas Jefferson, and what led you to write your book?
Well, again, thank you for having me on the podcast. I appreciate your time. I'm originally born and raised in Virginia, and that was really my affinity to Thomas Jefferson and history. My dad used to take me and my brother to all of the historical sites. You know, on a Sunday afternoon, we would go to Mount Vernon. We would go to Monticello, we'd go to some of the battlefields. So that's how I kind of had an affinity for history, especially Virginia history, growing up in Virginia. I went to law school and college in Alabama. I graduated from the University of Alabama with a degree in political science. I went to law school as a Juris Doctor from Samford University, which is in Birmingham, Alabama, the Cumberland School of Law.
I know why you like elephants and not Wolverines.
Roll Tide, I have to say, although we are in mourning for Nick Saban having departed. But I have written 4 books, 3 books on the Jefferson family, and 1 recent biography on George Mason. I've also authored several law review articles. So that's basically how I have arrived. I've been a lawyer for going on 30 years now. We do all what's called litigation, trial work. And that's kind of how I came up with the premise of the book, to kind of have a mock trial about Thomas Jefferson if a paternity case was actually brought in a modern court of law by Sally Hemings against Jefferson. What would the evidence be? What would be admissible? Who would be the expert witnesses? And whether or not she could prove actual paternity to Thomas Jefferson, not just a male Jefferson, but to Thomas Jefferson. And that's how the idea of the book came about. My father had done a lot of research back in 1975, when Fawn Brody's book came out, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate Portrait, and she concluded that Sally Hemings did have an affair with Jefferson. And I remember my dad, saying that this is preposterously out of character for Jefferson if it was true. And that kind of stuck with me through all the years. And in 2008, before he passed away, he gave me a lot of research on the DNA and some of the articles and some of the articles about his brother. I didn't even know he had a younger brother before I started to research this. And
a lot of scholars today surprisingly don't know that. People who have
don't know
books on Jefferson.
Yeah, he's the unknown brother, Randolph. But anyway, so all that research culminated into a law review article that was published in the Journal of Trial Advocacy called Hemings versus Jefferson. And from that law review article, I got a New York literary agent, and he sent it out to 10 publishers, and we had several offers on the book. And so 2009, the book came out.
Wow. Well, I was just thinking
Here's
if it
the
were in the
book.
court of law, reasonable doubt would be easy to establish with the evidence of his brother and his socializing.
Yeah, no, it's not only reasonable doubt. I mean, that's the criminal law, but in Florida, if it was a real civil lawsuit, it has to be by the preponderance or the greater weight of the evidence. And
Oh.
again, most of this in a real trial would be excluded. First of all, the DNA was never taken from Thomas Jefferson, so that would be the first exclusion. Secondly, all of this hearsay, gossip, speculation would not be allowed in a real courtroom. What would be allowed would be eyewitness testimony. And the most reliable eyewitness testimony was his overseer, Jefferson's overseer of about 18 years, Edmund Bacon. And we can talk about that. Edmund Bacon actually saw somebody else,
Right.
not Thomas Jefferson, coming out of Sally's room many a mornings when he went out to Monticello. So we have eyewitness testimony, in a court of law that would be direct evidence. Everything else is hearsay, secondhand, third-hand hearsay, but we have a direct.
Yeah, in my most recent book, I point out that, something has been pointed out by others, yourself included, is that there are 4 bits of direct testimony that offer pretty convincing evidence that Jefferson was not the father. And I'm always astonished to see how the folks at Monticello just sidestep all this. And the interesting thing, as you mentioned, their whole case is based on indirect testimony. They have not one bit of direct testimony. So we're going to get into that. I would just add,
Yeah.
I would talk to the people at Abbeville. Maybe we have the resources. It might be good to get you, Bill, to do an actual in-court case on Jefferson Sally Hemings and have, set that up. It might be a lot of fun to do, and I bet you it would get tons of views on YouTube.
I think it would. I've been approached to do that a couple times, to have an actual mock trial. I think it would be fascinating and really illuminate some of the issues that the public has not heard about.
Yeah.
Oh, I would love to be part of that. Oh, that's right up my alley. Question number 2. How does your book differ from other books on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings? Does your expertise as a lawyer give you a unique perspective? And if so, how does that happen?
Yeah, I think the book is unique in that it does take kind of the model of a mock trial, not necessarily a biography of Jefferson or one other person, but it takes the kind of the feel of his lawyer. Again, if a paternity suit was brought by Sally Hemings, so it's more of a mock trial, and I think the book is unique in that way, in that there's never been any other book that has had sort of a mock trial, calling witnesses on both sides, hearing witnesses on both sides, giving kind of an oral final argument to a jury. So I think it's unique in that perspective, in that it's not a traditional biography, but it's really a full-throated defense of Jefferson. And I wrote it from that point of view because, again, the public has only heard one side of the story for almost 200 years, and then certainly since 1998, when the DNA supposedly came out and matched a male Jefferson, not Thomas Jefferson, and the case has been closed. And my research is far from closed and far from definitive. But the reason I wrote the book is I wanted the public to hear the other side of the story that they have not heard.
And it's interesting, with my expertise as a philosopher in teaching critical thinking and logic, how using almost a mock trial lines up neatly with a sort of quality of argument, assessment of arguments. You know, when you're talking about, you've got terms we're going to talk about: primary, secondary evidence, direct testimony, indirect testimony, historical versus material evidence or biological evidence. And you look at it logically, and bring it into a court of law is looking at it logically. From my perspective, there's certain types of evidence that are not admissible because unpersuasive, and certain types of evidence that ought to be admissible because they are persuasive. So having that perspective in your book lines up neatly with a philosopher's perspective as well as a logical perspective.
Yeah, for example, the Madison Hemings, for some of the viewers, Madison Hemings was one of Sally's sons who gave an interview 50 years after the fact to an abolitionist editor, and a lot of the
Samuel
slave
Whitmore,
history-
1873, Samuel Whitmore.
Right. And most of the slave historians like Annette Gordon-Reed and Onoff really put a lot of stock in his interview. In a court of law, that would be totally excluded. It's complete hearsay, and it's hearsay upon hearsay. And if Wetmore was called as a witness, we would get to cross-examine him, his motives, the fact that he probably ghost wrote the entire interview for Madison, and he had a political agenda against Jefferson as a slave owner. So those are just some of the issues that I kind of address in the book as a mock trial: what would be admissible and what would be excluded.
To me, the crime, the absurdity of the pro-paternity case is that it's based exclusively on that testimony. This 1873 testimony, 50 years, born 50 years after the death of, after Thomas Jefferson's death, 1873, and that testimony, it drives the narrative, Monticello, behind Peter Onoff and Gordon Reed and all these people, and yet it's testimony that wouldn't be admitted into a court of law.
It would not, and more importantly, I mean, it plays, in my view, in my opinion, it plays the racist card, because Annette Gordon-Reed deprecates on all the, quote, white historians for not taking Madison Hemings' story at face value. And it doesn't have anything to do with race. It has to do with the credibility and the agenda of not only Madison Hemings, who obviously wanted Thomas Jefferson to be his father or some lineage because he was a most important person and president back then, but for Wetmore himself as an abolitionist, radical abolitionist, who wanted to castigate Jefferson as a slave owner. So the modern historians have injected, in my view, the race card, slavery, and it didn't have anything to do with race. That Dumas Malone, some of the most excellent, most revered historians rejected it. They say because they're white historians, which I think is complete nonsense.
Well, Gordon Reed says that explicitly in her 1997 book, that you can't, that historians, i.e. white historians, don't take the testimony seriously because he's a Black person. And that has nothing to do with the issue, as you say. So she literally says that. And she said something very, very similar on numerous occasions when she's been interviewed. So she's playing, that's what she adds, in my estimation, to Fawn Brody's book. I've said a number of times she borrows almost exclusively from Fawn Brody. Fawn Brody's the first at that testimony, 1873. She does the same thing, but she gives it a racial slant, like you said. I agree with that.
Totally agree.
Oh, wow. Okay. Question number 3. What exactly is the difference between primary and secondary evidence? What is the difference between physical evidence, meaning DNA study of 1998, and the historical evidence? And can you illustrate with examples of the Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings debate?
Sure. Direct evidence would be, for example, objective evidence like the DNA match. Direct evidence, again, would be eyewitness testimony like Edmund Bacon. The historical, and what most of the historians at Monticello base is on what's called oral tradition or oral history. And that's second, what somebody said to somebody, to somebody, to somebody 200 years after the fact. That is indirect and circumstantial and excluded hearsay. So the direct evidence would, of course, be the science, be the DNA. But the DNA, again, going back and telling the viewers, the DNA only matched a male Jefferson from the Hemings line. It did not match Thomas Jefferson. And there were at least 8 other male Jefferson nephews, cousins, brothers who certainly have the same DNA, who are certainly candidates for the fatherhood of Sally's children, one or most of them. So direct evidence would certainly be the science and eyewitness testimony, but the oral tradition is what most of the slave historians at Monticello really hang their hat on. Like I said, Madison Hemings interview, the fact that there was they think some sort of deal was made with Sally coming back from France with Jefferson. And there's not a iota scintilla of evidence of that, directly or indirectly. So that would be the direct evidence. The indirect evidence is certainly the hearsay, but the direct evidence, again, going back to Bacon, the overseer, I mean, he was there for almost 20 years. And he would have been there for at least 2, if not 3, of Sally's births and pregnancies. And he said directly to his biographer that he saw somebody and he named him, but the biographer did not name him. It was most probably one of the Carr brothers or Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph. So he admitted that name, but he definitely said it was not Thomas Jefferson. That's direct evidence that Sally had probably more than one paramour, lover, or sexual relationship.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah, there
wow.
are, you talk about the oral testimony. Monticello's been for decades, not for decades, but for many years, collecting oral testimonies. And yet there's no qualification that they don't go out to explain that oral testimonies really don't say much of anything. They don't tell you that. They collect it and they're retelling these stories as if these oral stories that have been passed on from generation to generation are just as probatively availing as direct testimony. And I think that's criminal when you don't qualify it, you don't explain.
I totally agree with you. And it's a double standard because up until 1976, the oral history said that the Hemings family or children were fathered by an uncle. Randolph Jefferson, the younger brother, was known as Uncle Randolph. So if you're going to take one oral history, you have to take the second oral history. So they discount the fact that the oral history up until 76, Fawn Brody said that the Hemings children were fathered by an uncle, not Thomas Jefferson, by an uncle. And Randolph Jefferson was known as Uncle Randolph at Monticello. He not only was known as Uncle Randolph, but he was at Monticello 9 months before she gave birth to Eston Hemings. We have that in the letters that he was expected there. So, and we have letters from the slaves saying he came out at night.
Monticello weaseled out of that one when he wanted to say, okay, he was invited, but he might not have gone. We don't know. And there's, I have a book on the letters from Thomas Jefferson and his brother Randolph. And there's every reason to think that Randolph was mentally challenged, to put it bluntly, and he relied completely on Thomas and Thomas's advice for running his affairs, as if Thomas were his father. In some sense, Thomas was, but from my perspective, I think Randolph would have made many, many trips to Monticello when Jefferson was around to get his advice and help. And people at Monticello just dismissed that.
Yeah. Yep. No, I agree. I agree totally.
Wow. We really do need a mock trial. Okay, question number 4. What do you take to be the strongest argument for Thomas Jefferson's paternity? And then also, what do you take to be the strongest argument against Thomas Jefferson's paternity?
Well, I say in my book that really, Sally, if she comes into a court of law, she would have 2 pieces of evidence that are fairly strong. One, if the DNA was allowed, there would be a suggestion that a male Jefferson definitely matched Hemings' descendant. She couldn't say it was Thomas Jefferson, but a male Jefferson, and that's very strong evidence. Secondly, there's a lot of evidence that Jefferson was probably in and around Monticello at the same time that she was there in the conception periods. And they have,
If she was there.
If she was there, absolutely. But that's another piece of strong evidence that they depend on, and a lot of historians depend on, and the Monticello report in 1998 or 99 came out. They had a model saying that he was there at all the conception periods, but that's probably the 2 strongest pieces of evidence for
that is for me too. The notion that Jefferson was at Monticello roughly 9 months prior to conception each time. And a lot of people treat that in philosophical terminology as a necessary condition, something that has to be the case if Jefferson is the father. If Jefferson should turn out to be the father, but it's really not a necessary condition. It's only necessary, added the qualification that Sally Hemings was at Monticello as well. And you make that point in your book. I do as well, others. We don't know where she was. She probably was, but we don't know.
We don't know. And he had 3 enslaved women were named Sally. So we don't know which Sally was here, which Sally was there. They lent out slaves to family members. But that's the strongest for Sally, for her paternity. I think the strongest against is Edmund Bacon. Not only Edmund Bacon, who says that he saw somebody else, not Thomas Jefferson, coming out of her house many a morning, but he has 2 or 3 private letters that Jefferson wrote that he specifically denied what he called federal slanders. One was to his Secretary of Navy, Robert Smith, where he admits to only one of the charges. He flirted with a married woman when he was a young man, but he says, I deny all of the other federal slanders. I am not guilty of any of them. He wrote another 2 or 3 letters to several other colleagues saying that the federal slanders are just those, but he never denied them in public. And that was his philosophy. He felt that if he denied one in public, it would lead to another one, and he would be, refuting these slanders in public, which he did not want to do. So he did it privately to his family and his friends. And I think those are the 2 strongest pieces.
Yeah,
Edmund Bacon and his private.
And I think he's right to say that to some extent when you address slander, and Jefferson was, even though he was fairly thin, as most people say, never took, from what I know, seriously the accusation that he was the father of any of the children. And to what extent it bothered him, it just didn't seem from any of the sources we have to really bother him that much.
Right. Now, I totally agree. And but I think if we had found, if the letter exists, the letter to Robert Smith, that was, I think, a cover letter to Levi Lincoln, that he probably said something specifically about the Sally Hemings charge, and that would be a direct refutation. So I think those are the 2 strongest arguments against his paternity.
Yeah, and we have to add too is that the people. I will add there's a change of leadership. Jane Kaminsky's the new president, so we don't know what direction they're going to take. We can be slightly optimistic that there might be a turn of events or more open discussion. But so I just wanted to throw that in as well. I was always sort of intrigued by Abigail Adams' testimony when Sally Hemings came to England en route to go into Paris about the gross immaturity of Sally Hemings. And to me, that means a lot, simply because Thomas Jefferson, of course, being such an intelligent person, you're asked to, Sally Hemings was 14 when she arrives in Paris. She's with Jefferson's daughter, Maria, who's 8 at the time. And Abigail says on 2 occasions that the child is more mature than the woman who's looking after her, the young girl who's looking after her. So that, if we take Abigail Adams as a credible person, we put Sally Hemings' maturity level at something 8 or below. And you're going to ask me to believe that Thomas Jefferson is a man of really deep and wide intellect, is going to fall in love with a 7-year-old kid?
Yeah, no, it belies common sense. I mean, Sally Hemings was only 10 years old when Jefferson left Monticello to go to France. He had probably no idea, other than she was 10 years and, a household servant, about her. I mean, she was 14 when she arrived in Paris. He had no idea she was coming. Somebody else was supposed to accompany her. So it defies common sense that a man of Jefferson's taste and refinement would start an affair with a 14-year-old slave girl who he probably did not even remember. If he did have an affair, it probably would have been with Maria Causeway. But again, it would not have been an affair because his wife had died several years beforehand, and Maria Causeway in France, probably reminded Jefferson of his wife. She was a painter, very creative. She played, I think, the piano. So if he was going to have an affair, it was not with a 14-year-old slave girl. It probably would have been with Maria Causeway, who he, penned his famous letter from.
And he could have had an affair with many other women had he had chosen while he was in Paris or elsewhere. I mean, I'm certain there were opportunities for such an intelligent, wasn't the most handsome of all people, but he wasn't unattractive, but he was highly intelligent. And that, of course, is, well, look what happened with Benjamin Franklin in Paris. He really had a lot of fun, did he not? I just, from what we know, and I've written on Jefferson's paramours, his loves, his Rebecca Burwell, all the way up to Maria Causeway. I have a whole book, if you don't know, on Jefferson and Maria Causeway, their complete correspondence. Jefferson always fell in love with highly cerebral, talented females. When I say cerebral, at least in the fine arts, musical, artistic, and there's no evidence whatsoever that Sally Hemings could even read or write. We don't know whether she did or not, probably couldn't, and probably was not talented when it came to any of the fine arts that we know of. So why would he have fallen in love with her, regardless of whether she turned out to be a stunning beauty?
Nah, doesn't make sense. Doesn't make common sense.
No, but see, that's part of the illogic of the pro-paternity people, is they put it forth as if the more absurd the argument seems, the stronger it must be. I don't understand that. It's not they have no concern for cogency of the argumentation that's being put forth. And no, you mentioned before about, you alluded to cherry picking. They're experts in sweeping away the sort of direct testimonies that you talked about with Bacon and pairing these objections without really dealing with them. If you go to Monticello's webpage, you can have a lot of fun with that. But I come to the conclusion is that they know that their argument, that their case is pathetically bad. I'll say this, on their webpage, they claimed in 2008 that Jefferson definitely was the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. And yet they give 10 different arguments for the fact. You don't argue for facts, right? If I say it's sunny outside, you look out and say it's sunny outside, you confirm it that way. You don't need to argue for it. So that's telling as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that goes kind of to our last questions, I think. Why are so many learned people and really educated people, why did they want to
Bill, Donna's got to ask that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ask your own questions and answer them.
Taking my job.
I know you're a lawyer and you're used to doing stuff
like that.
She's got to ask.
Didn't want to steal your thunder, Donna.
She'll take it out on me after we're done.
Yes, I will. Um, though the argument pro-paternity is unpersuasive, pro-paternity predominates in the scholarship on Jefferson. Why are people, even educated people, so willing to believe in a story that is likely fiction? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, very simply. It wouldn't be important or sexy to be a descendant of Randolph Jefferson or Peter Carr or Samuel Carr. It is completely important historically to be a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. And that's why people go overboard with trying against common sense on trying to make Thomas Jefferson the father of Sally Hemings' children. And again, the evidence shows that it probably, most probably, was Randolph Jefferson and or the Carr brothers. The Carr brothers actually admitted, Samuel Carr, I think it was Samuel or Peter, actually admitted to Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the grandson, that he had an affair, and Samuel had an affair with the Hemings women. So
They said something to the effect, "Look what we're doing to the old man here now."
yeah,
They laughed.
the old man suffering for our misdeeds, I think was the exact quote. So yeah, so the educated historians, want Thomas Jefferson because Thomas Jefferson is a symbol for this country. Again, Peter Carr, Samuel Carr, Randolph Jefferson are not symbols, and it would be less important. Where we go from here is, if Monticello was serious, they would engage in finding other descendants of Sally Hemings and do DNA studies themselves. If they're saying that all the children are sired or fathered by Thomas Jefferson, then do the DNA studies. But if they don't, then we're stuck with one DNA study from
Do you know
1998.
anything about the proposed studies that Smithsonian Institute supposedly did some research in?
I do not. I have not
anything
heard
about that?
I have not heard anything about that, but I mean that if Monticello was really serious about getting to the bottom of the paternity, they would initiate their own DNA study, but they're not. They're content with 1998 DNA saying that a male Jefferson. And I say in the book, I interviewed the two insiders to that DNA study. One was the genealogist, Herb Barger, and the other was Dr. Ken Wallenborn, who I think you've interviewed before.
Right. Yeah.
They both were intimately connected to the 1998 DNA study. And in fact, Herb Barger was the one who told the historian Joseph Ellis, "Why are you saying that Jefferson was the father? It could be Randolph." And he said, supposedly, I didn't even know he had a younger brother.
This guy wrote a book on Thomas Jefferson.
So, they're satisfied. And I think it goes to a lot of politics involved with Monticello. They get a lot of money from a lot of progressive groups to kind of interpret and promote the Sally Hemings story at Monticello. So I think they're satisfied with no more research. It's decided, and it certainly has not been decided.
Yeah, in 2018, this is what caused me to move to Lynchburg here, and I've been here for 6 years. I'll be moving back to Flint, Michigan in a couple of weeks. That bothered me so much. I moved here to try to combat it, hopefully to get a foot in the door at Poplar Forest, but I've been banned at Poplar Forest as well because I don't share the woke vision, the postmodernist vision that Jefferson was a racist and hypocrite. The syllogism, slavery is bad, anyone who owns slaves is bad, so Thomas Jefferson is bad, right? That fails to accommodate the many African-American people who are implicated in the slave trade from Africa, the number of African-Americans who themselves own slaves, both white and black. So we get a very narrow depiction of everything's going on.
Yeah, and
there's no motivation to change it.
Yeah, you make a great point. They conflate the two issues. Whether or not he had a sexual relationship is one issue. Whether or not his issues on slavery and mixing of the races is a second, totally separate issue. I'm only concentrating on whether he had a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old girl, and in all probability, he did not. So I think Monticello is conflating both of those issues, slavery, race, and the sexual relationship, and you have to take them all separately.
Yeah, that makes perfectly good logical sense, but I don't think they're looking at it logically. I think they know that they're not acting rationally on this matter, but it's a business, and one could argue that they're interested in the greenbacks. I noticed that prior to the 2008, what I call manifesto, what said Jefferson definitely the father of all the kids. They stated as fact. Leslie Green Bowman, the president, comes out and states that. How they can do that, it's astonishing to me, right? So where does that come from? That it's a fact. It's a way of blocking you and people like me. Out of my 27, 28 books on Jefferson, not one has ever been for sale at Monticello. I was told that I really wasn't relevant as a scholar. I find that funny.
Well, I'll tell you one story that Ken Wallenborn shared with me. He asked Leslie Bowman, he goes, why haven't you invited Bill Hyland to talk on his book? This was 2010, 2011. She goes, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that. It would upset the staff too much. That was her response to.
Yeah, it's a Coke Pepsi thing for people. I was at the African American Museum in Lynchburg, and as I toured it, and I spoke with one of the board members there about talking on Thomas Jefferson on this very issue. And I said, it's very likely he never had an affair with Sally Hemings. And her response is, no, our people wouldn't want to hear that. It's a legacy museum. They wouldn't want to hear that. It's not a matter of whether it's true or not of having both sides of the story. It's a certain story that they have that their people want to hear, presumably. And so we're obliged to tell them what they want to hear and not work at the truth, I guess.
Yeah, it's astonishing. But I'll leave you with one last quote, Donna, from Thomas Jefferson that I'll read. And this is his exact quote. He said, quote, all should be laid open to you without reserve, for there is not a truth existing which I fear or would wish unknown to the whole world. And he said that 50 days before his death in a letter to Henry Lee. So there, I mean, you have it. There's not anything that he would want unknown to the world. And this would include if he had an affair with a 14-year-old slave girl. So you have it in his own words that he basically denied the allegations, and you have eyewitness testimony that it was someone else besides Thomas Jefferson. So, in the end, I think, the public has been sold a bill of goods based on the DNA, 1998 DNA, but there is certainly much evidence to prove basically that he did not have an affair, probably with his younger brother, Randolph, or both of the Carr brothers were the true candidates for the paternity.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us, Bill. It's
Thank
been
you.
informative as usual. And
It was a pleasure.
thank you for bringing your expertise to bear on the issue of whether we brought this into court, what would happen. Clearly, Jefferson would be exculpated, right? Well, thank you. And that's it. I don't have anything to talk about what's going to be on next week. We'll leave some contact information for Bill at the end of this video and some information about getting his book. Thank you for joining us, and we'll do this again